Bioenergetics is a topic that often confuses or scares students enrolled in exercise physiology. I will say, however, that understanding the energy supply of skeletal muscle is really one of the keys to being able to maximally enhance human performance. So in this presentation, what I hope to do is to go over a molecule called ATP because it plays a central role in allowing skeletal muscle to contract. And if we do not provide a constant supply of ATP to working muscle, human performance will suffer. Maximal human performance really is an energy supply issue. Typically, the limiting factor in any maximal performance type activity, whether it be an endurance event or a short duration power event, is going to rely on energy supply. And if we can supply energy quickly enough, we can maximize performance. And this is because muscle cells need a constant supply of energy to fuel muscle contraction or to hold a muscle contraction. During exercise, the energy demand within skeletal muscle increases dramatically. Running out of energy or running out of ATP means work stops within the muscle, which means we can no longer maintain a contraction or maintain the same force of a contraction. So the ability to supply energy throughout an activity will determine the intensity at which we can perform that activity. Now, we get our energy for muscle activity from the food and the drink that we bring into our body. And this is going to be utilized to fuel this muscle activity. However, there are some other steps involved. The primary molecule that is utilized for fueling cellular activity is ATP. ATP, also known as adenosine triphosphate, is the fuel. It's the molecule that will provide the energy for nearly all cellular activities, including skeletal muscle contraction. So ATP is a fuel that resides in most cells in the body and is there to help fuel different types of activities. ATP is a molecule with an adenine component, a ribose component, and 3 linked phosphate groups. These phosphate groups are what give it the name triphosphate. So adenosine triphosphate has 3 phosphate groups. These phosphates are bound together with high energy bonds, and it's that energy that the skeletal muscle will utilize to fuel muscle activity and muscle contraction. So ATP is readily available within skeletal muscle for when you begin an exercise. The ATP, to get the energy out of it, needs to be broken down into ADP and a phosphate group, and this will release energy. This chemical reaction, as well as the reverse reaction, are shown on this slide, but I want to talk about them in a little more detail. So once again, we see the formula or the reaction that allows ATP to be broken down to ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, because it only has 2 phosphates, a free phosphate group that will be circulating within the cytoplasm, and the release of energy. It's this energy that is then used to fuel muscle contraction, the energy released by breaking one of those phosphate bonds in the ATP molecule. This reaction, the breakdown of ATP, occurs fairly readily and fairly quickly, and is considered to be an exergonic reaction because it releases energy and does not require energy to be input for the reaction to occur. This reaction occurs very quickly and is allowed to happen quickly and sped up by the presence of an enzyme called ATPase, which is also present within skeletal muscle. So again, this reaction will occur as long as ATP is available and when the muscles want to contract. And this is how we fuel muscle contraction. Now, we have to remember that ATP supply is limited, so we can only break down ATP for so long before we run out. And in the case of a very fast, a sprint or a high energy type activity, this can occur in a matter of seconds. So we do need to find a way to replace ATP so the skeletal muscle can continue to function and cause the contractions that we need to allow us to move or do whatever activity it is that we want to engage in. So this begs the question, where do we get the energy to make more ATP? And that really is the key to enhancing human performance. We need to build and enhance the systems that allow us to make ATP from the waste products associated with ATP utilization. So, how do we make more ATP? We do this by actually turning the reaction that we've been talking about in reverse. We take the byproducts of ADP and phosphate, and in this case, we add energy and form what's called an endergonic reaction. So we add energy to ADP and phosphate, and we stick the phosphate group back to the ADP, creating a new ATP molecule that can then be used again. So by adding energy, we can turn this reaction in reverse and make more ATP, which allows skeletal muscle to continue the activity that it's been doing. Where do we get that energy? We get that energy from breaking down carbs, fats, and proteins to a much limited extent. We primarily use carbohydrates and fats in varying percentages depending upon the intensity of the exercise. So our body will utilize carbohydrates, lipids or fats, and proteins to make more ATP during exercise. Carbohydrate is typically stored in the form of glycogen, both within skeletal muscle and in the liver, but we also have free-floating glucose that is found in the bloodstream and also in skeletal muscle that we can utilize as a fuel to make more ATP. Lipids are stored in the skeletal muscle cells, as well as throughout the body in the form of triglycerides, and then are broken down to fatty acids when we need to utilize them to resynthesize ATP. And then proteins are also utilized, specifically amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, and they can be utilized to make ATP as well. These are fairly complex processes, so they'll be covered in a future presentation. So to review, ATP is the molecule that is going to be utilized by skeletal muscle to fuel muscle activity. ATP is found in the cells in limited quantities, and we need to then break down carbohydrate, lipids, and or proteins to make more ATP during physical activity.